Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. My name is Brian Ward, and I'm the assistant director here tonight, or every day. It's been a long day bringing out chairs and doing some lifting. You know, when we started this thing a few years ago, we were just thankful when 10 or 15 people showed up. Now, we just spent about an hour pulling all these chairs out because we knew it was going to be a big crowd. You always know it's going to be a big crowd when you talk to your speaker and he asks you what the record for the room is. So, and I think we're pretty close tonight. While we're still waiting, I'd like to go over some of the other lectures that we have going on and coming up. Some of them are very exciting. One thing we try to do with this lecture series is try to pull out some things that may have been left behind from the history books. I figure most in this room, as they've taken West Virginia history, these are some of the lost gems that are turning up and that we're finding out, and we'd like to share them. On April 2nd, we're going to have Dr. Charles Ledbetter from West Virginia State. He's going to talk about the West Virginia State College Aviation Program. A lot of folks don't know that a lot of the Tuskegee Airmen actually came from West Virginia State and went on to Alabama and took part. On March 14th, I see Doug Wood. Where are you, Doug? He's back there somewhere, always anonymous. He's doing a very interesting one on the roots of the Uncivil War, the 250th anniversary of the Cornstalk Campaign. Those of you who know your West Virginia history know that Cornstalk was a Native American leader that did an amazing job on the battlefield. And Doug's going to share more information you guys might not know. On May 7th, we're going to have Russ Barber and Dick Faust talking about one of the more interesting governors of West Virginia, Governor William Marlin. You guys probably know Bill Marlin as being the governor when he desegregated West Virginia schools, one of the first to do so. He's also the governor who came up with the severance tax, which we are seeing the benefits of still today. But most of you are sitting there looking at me, realizing that he's also known for being an alcoholic taxi cab driver in Chicago. So we're going to talk about the interesting career of him. So those are a couple of things that are coming up. If you'd like to find out more about our lectures, please make sure we have your email address, and we will add you to our e-blast list where we announce all our upcoming events, and you can get that information. So if you're interested in being a part of that, let me know. Afterwards, we'll get your email address, and we'll make sure you get the information. Our speaker tonight is a good friend of mine, and I actually was doing the math a little bit ago, and I don't know if you realize this, Billy Joe, but you and I have been friends for over 20 years now, which is a little shocking for us. Billy Joe is one of those folks, when I went to college, he was actually doing history work, and he was doing public history work. And it's a program that I really liked when you worked at the Institute for the History of Technology and Industrial Archaeology. Sadly, that's no longer part of the university. But Billy Joe and I have a lot of stories. Some I can tell you, some I can't. Just say neither one of us are going to be in political office. But Billy Joe has done it all from a historian's perspective. Right now, he's faculty at West Virginia State University. He's also worked doing documentaries for public television. He's done industrial archaeology work. He's worked for the Park Service. So his resume is long, and his history is top-notch. He's been on several television programs. Many of you came out last year or the year before when his book, Charleston, Then and Now, came out. And he's currently working on a manuscript for the history of Charleston. And Billy Joe and I agree on a lot of things. The one thing we probably will never agree on is that the true capital of West Virginia belongs in Wheeling. I know this is a hostile crowd for that. But without further ado, Dr. Billy Joe Peyton.
That's a tough introduction to top. I'm thankful that there was no internet or Facebook in those days, Brian. I guess the way you described me is a jack of all trades, master of none, which probably suits me to a T and is appropriate because I love history of all types. And as Brian mentioned, I used to work at WVU under the esteemed Dr. Emery Kemp, who instilled in me an appreciation for the past and its preservation, not just talking about history, but also trying to commemorate it and preserve it on the ground. So as I talk tonight, I will give you the short history of Charleston, and the original title of this was A Brief History of Charleston, because in the hour and a few more minutes that I have to talk, I cannot go into too much detail, but what I want to do is touch on the history of the town, the city of Charleston over the course of the last 225 plus years, and focus on some of the artifacts, some of the structures that are still on the ground. So you'll see some of them in the slides that I have. Now for those of you sitting here, this is not a real good location because I'm right in front of the screen. So I'm going to try to get out of your way as much as I can, and realizing that the microphone is needed to project my voice. Brian, how does it do if someone steps away from the mic? Can you hear me back there? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. I like to roam around a little bit, so I'll come back to the mic, but I may move, especially so you all can see. And then I'll move over here and instruct you guys. If we go back to the beginning, which I don't want to dwell on too much because there are far more experts in the room that know about the prehistory of Charleston and the Kanawha Valley. People have lived here for about 12,000 years that we know of, and possibly longer. The archaeological record has not revealed much prior to that, but someday it may. And we can break the prehistory of the valley and, by association, Charleston, into these four basic groups, beginning with the earliest habitation, moving up to the archaic, the woodland, which one of the subgroups of the woodland culture are the mound builders, who have left their legacy on the land. Unfortunately, most of what the mound builders left behind has been destroyed over the course of the last 150 years or so. However, at South Charleston, we still have the second largest Adena burial mound in the state of West Virginia. The last Native Americans to be here when the first Europeans arrived were the Fort Ancient people, the late pre-contact, as they're officially known. And by about 1650, that culture had moved on, disappeared, were no longer here in large numbers, although there were still a few pockets. And their remnants would remain for the early Europeans who come here to wonder who these people were, and ascribe some of their deeds to everything from ancient civilizations from another planet to finally recognizing and understanding that the prehistory civilizations were smarter than they've been given credit for. Now, if we begin the history, the historical part of Charleston's past, that actually begins about the time of the Battle of Point Pleasant. One of the first groups that comes through would be Andrew Lewis's group of Virginia militia on the way to Point Pleasant. And in that group was George Clendenin. Clendenin, who would camp here on his way to Point Pleasant in 1774, viewed the area at the mouth of the Elk River, probably made a mental note to self, this looks like promising real estate. Thomas Bullitt had been here the year previously in 1773, and Bullitt, who was a major, had been given a military grant for his service to Virginia as a result of service both in the French and Indian War and later in Dunmore's War, which the Battle of Point Pleasant. I always tell my students, it's very easy to remember the Lord Dunmore's War because there was one battle, and that's the Battle of Point Pleasant. Some students still get it wrong on the exam. By 1775, Bullitt would lay claim to 2 parcels of land which would make up the future city of Charleston. One was on the west side of Elk at its mouth, constituting 1,240 acres, which today we would know as the west side of Charleston. He also patented 1,030 acres east of Elk River, which would become Charleston until about 1895, when the west side and the east end were joined together as Charleston. Bullitt, in 1779, Thomas Bullitt dies. His brother Cuthbert obtains Bullitt's property. Bullitt had obtained his land, as I mentioned, for his military service. His brother Cuthbert Bullitt obtains his property. In 1781, Cuthbert would give the west side holdings to his family, to his next of kin, his 4 daughters. That land would eventually wind up in the hands of the Bream family. And if you're from the west side of Charleston, you know Bream Church. There also used to be a cemetery on the grounds of the Bream Church, which is long since gone. The 1,030 acres on the east side of Elk conveyed to George Clendenin in 1787. And that's the beginning of Charleston. And the Clendenin name is synonymous with the early founding of Fort Lee, for which Charleston would spring, or from which Charleston would spring. In 1788, because settlement in this part of the lower Kanawha Valley was beginning to grow, Clendenin would petition the government of Virginia for a fort, for protection, along with the settlers that were in this area very interested in getting protection from the Virginia establishment. And in 1788, a fort was erected, which was unofficially known as Clendenin Station or Clendenin's Fort, but had the official name of Fort Lee. For, as you can see up here, yeah, there it is. General Henry Lee, or Light Horse Harry, who was Robert E. Lee's father. Lee was a veteran. He also would become governor of Virginia later. Fort Lee would become a frontier outpost from 1788 till the end of the Frontier Wars, or the Indian Wars, or as the European settlers called it, the Virginians called it, the Indian Menace. When that ended in 1794, 1795, with the Battle of Fallen Timbers, followed by the Treaty of Greenville, the fort itself fell into disrepair. But in the meantime, in 1794, Clendenin and the Virginia Assembly would establish Charlestown on the site of Fort Lee. There was a little problem with the name Charlestown, as you probably know. There was already a Charlestown in the eastern panhandle, and over time, Charlestown on the Elk becomes Charleston. It would be named for George Clendenin and his brother William and their younger brother Joseph's father, Charles, who had actually died at Fort Lee and is buried somewhere between Kanawha Boulevard and I guess it's about the 12 or 1300 block of the boulevard. He's long since probably turned to dust, but he's in there somewhere. In 1796, Clendenin would convey his land on the east side of Elk to Joseph Ruffner. Clendenin, interestingly, doesn't stick around. He would grow disillusioned with the slow pace of settlement here, eventually relocates to Point Pleasant, and would die before Charleston really grew, before he did not live to see Charleston become a town, much less a city. Joseph Ruffner enters the picture. The Ruffner family was from Luray area of Virginia, and Ruffner comes and he would eventually acquire the bottomlands from the mouth of Elk, more or less all the way up to Malden. He and his family would be the first family to start leasing property to drill or to begin making salt. And then his sons begin pioneer technology to actually drill for salt. Interesting story, if you follow the Fort Lee site for about almost 100 years, the cabin itself survived as the Truslow House until it was purchased by who else? John P. Hale, who shows up in all of Charleston's early history in some way, shape, or form. He would wind up acquiring the property where the fort used to stand, moved the log building back to Virginia Street, and it perished a few years later in a disastrous fire in 1891. Now, the site of Fort Lee, there are at least 3 markers that commemorate Fort Lee on the boulevard in Charleston. One is your conventional highway marker that I've circled on the left. The fort itself stood at roughly the intersection of Brook Street and Canal Street, or Canal Boulevard. There was a depression there. It was a low spot, a good spot for a canoe landing, and also obviously there had to be fresh water nearby. And if you go out to that point today and look up and down the river, it's a nice straight stretch of the river, so it probably offered good upstream and downstream vantage points. The other marker, the second marker, is a boulder that was erected on the other side of the boulevard in 1915 by the colonial Danes. That was the first marker that was placed, and then later a sundial was placed near where Charles Clendenin died, and then later moved across the boulevard to the riverside, and it was just restored recently. This is the first plat of Charleston when Charleston was established in 1794 as Charlestown, as the settlement at the mouth of Elk. There's not much to write home about. Charleston was a small frontier outpost with 2 streets, 5 unnamed cross streets, which if you can, it doesn't show on here, but actually on the hand-drawn version of this, the streets are simply named 1 through 5, the cross streets. Real original. And well, they are in there. 1st Street, 2nd, 3rd, and so on and so forth. From roughly Clendenin Street today, a little bit to the east of Clendenin, about probably where Shoney's is and where Long John Silver's just used to be until a few weeks ago, to Cox's Lane, or Capitol Street, is where the original plots were laid out. The properties were then divided up and sold. The public square, which would become Courthouse Square, was just about in the middle, and it's noted by the green block, or blocks on both of the images. When I tell students that Daniel Boone lived here, hopefully they know who Daniel Boone is first. Second, they say, why didn't we know this? And I'm not sure, I cannot answer that question, other than Boone had such an illustrious history. There was so much written about him that exploits in Kentucky, what he did here sort of paled in comparison in terms of the history books. But Daniel Boone did live in the Kanawha Valley for a number of years. He came to Point Pleasant somewhere around 1788. Was named Lieutenant Colonel of the Kanawha County Militia, which was the newly established county of Kanawha, which had been carved from Greenbrier County and was much larger than the Kanawha County that exists today. Somewhere around 1792, Boone relocated to the present site of Charleston. He had a contract to provide supplies for a number of frontier outposts. Something went wrong with that contract, and Boone didn't fulfill all of his contracts. Got upset, left Point Pleasant, and moved upriver to present-day Kanawha City, somewhere around where the shops at Kanawha are located today. As an early historian noted, Roy Bird Cook said that he figured that Boone's cabin was somewhere on the upper end of Kanawha Avenue, near an old cemetery. And Boone had obtained the property, he rented it from the Reynolds family. He didn't own it. Boone, being a restless spirit, did not stay here very long. He was one of our 2 delegates to the state legislature from 1791 to 95. And George Clendenin was the second one. And Boone and other members of the legislature typically walked to Richmond for their service. And they would stay for months, however long the session was in, turn around and come back home. Boone often detoured on the way back home and took hunting trips. And on more than one occasion, reports of Boone being gone missing spread throughout the Kanawha settlements. And invariably Boone, and often his son was with him, he would show up a few weeks or months later and say, yeah, I got way late, I was off on a hunting trip somewhere. So it's a whole different world in those days. You could disappear for months and leave the family back here to worry, and nothing could be done about it. By 1795, Boone, his wife Rebecca, and some of their family that had come with them to the valley left for Kentucky, and Boone eventually wound up in Missouri. Even though he blazed the frontier and was a frontier scout, he, like a lot of these other early intrepid frontiersmen and women, died virtually penniless. He had to depend on his children to take care of him in his old age, although he did live to be about 83 years of age. Boone, one of the stories of Boone in the valley is that while he was here trapping before he actually moved here, and what attracted Daniel Boone to this area was the abundant game that came down to the salt licks at the mouth of Campbell's Creek, at Thoroughfare Gap, at present-day Malden, between Malden and the upper end of Charleston. There would have been a number of salt marshes. Animals of all shapes and sizes came to the marshes, and if you were a hunter and a trapper like Boone, Simon Kenton, and others, that's prime hunting there. Boone came originally for that purpose. One of the stories that I've always read and heard and remember seeing was a cave that was in the hillside, which is now since gone. It was obliterated when the interstate was built. That marker used to be in front of the cave on the road, which has also been rerouted, Piedmont and Route 60. And that marker commemorating Boone living here is now in Daniel Boone Park. Abundant natural resources are one of the main reasons that everybody from Daniel Boone to the early salt makers to coal operators today come to this part of the world. 1797, Joseph Ruffner would lease a portion of the salt lands, the salt marshes, to Elisha Brooks, who started the first commercial salt-making operation. And it was a very primitive operation. Essentially, it was boiling down the brine in kettles using wood for fuel. By 1808, Joseph Ruffner, who died in 1803, his sons became the first real drilling pioneers in the salt industry, especially the oldest son, David, who developed drilling technology, which later was transferred into other industries, into oil and natural gas drilling. But they pioneered drilling technology that allowed the salt makers here to drill deeper, get richer brine, and consequently make more money with their salt. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to the Ruffners, and their technology later goes up to Drake Well in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in the late 1800s. Now if you just scan through this, a lot of wording, I realize. What I wanted to focus on here is that natural gas was struck almost about the same place where Fort Lee stood. And it was considered to be a nuisance at the time. It was a novelty and a nuisance. The Burning Springs, which is where I always know as DuPont High School, DuPont Middle School is now, upstream of Charleston, was a novelty. When travelers came through, they would often light the pockets of natural gas, and just for entertainment. George Washington actually owned the Burning Springs at one point. David Ruffner starts to use coal to fuel the salt furnaces because, believe it or not, by the 18-teens, the forests were beginning to become depleted because so much salt was being made. By 1841, natural gas is used to fuel the salt furnaces, and by then, the canal salt industry is in its prime. The salt industry would be the first major industry in the valley. It begins to attract developers, settlers, and slaves. Because of a shortage of free labor, the salt makers began importing slaves from the Shenandoah and elsewhere, and Kanawha County becomes one of the highest, has one of the highest populations of enslaved African Americans in all of Western Virginia. By the 1820s and 1830s, the salt makers, many of which had lived around the salt furnaces, began migrating downstream to build stately homes along the river on today Canal Boulevard and elsewhere to escape the undesirable elements of Malden, which typically would have been the pollution and the nefarious characters that came there to work, and also the high number of African Americans that were enslaved and working. By 1830, the canal industry surpasses 1 million bushels of salt produced. By the late 1840s, the Canal Valley would lead the nation in salt production. Over 3.2 million bushels produced in that 1 year. And as I have to explain to my students, if you're not familiar with a bushel basket, it's roughly 50 pounds, depending on what's in it, whether it's apples, peaches, salt, or what have you. In 1850, the population of the county was just over 15,000. Over 3,000 of that number were slaves, making the overall black population, slave and free, here in Kanawha County at 21% of the population. I like to point out that African Americans have been a prominent part of the history of this valley since its earliest settlement by Europeans. Some of you obviously have seen this before because you're familiar with the history of the salt industry, but this, if you can see all those dots along the river on both sides, they each, I have a pointer, I'll point some of them out to you. Each of these dots on both sides of the river are furnace operations. From Charleston upstream to Marmette on both sides of the canal, at one point 52 furnace operations were in business. Now imagine the dirt and the grime and the pollution not only in the air but also in the river. And the Kanawha River was known as Old Greasy because of the pollution. We fast forward a few years. Charleston is beginning to grow into a handsome village by the mid-1800s. And from a very slow start, one of the reasons that Clendenin gave up his claim is that people just weren't coming here. And you can look at the population of Charleston, it doesn't grow much until really the 1830s, when the population begins to increase to over 1,000. By the time we get to 1860, the population is roughly 1,600, not a booming metropolis, but described as a handsome village with many buildings of the old type, was one description that was used. And generally the people living here are described as being very nice, genteel, and a very strong connection to old Virginia, for obvious reasons, because we were Virginia in those days. Oops, someone forgot to turn off the phone. This is a painting from 1854, and if you look right there, that would be Haddad Riverfront Park today. That's the downtown area. Interstate 79 and 77 go up the Elk Valley right there. So the interstate bridge is probably right in this area here. The mouth of the Elk is somewhere right here. Several things changed in the 1830s. Virginia had a constitutional convention in 1829 and 30 because Westerners were growing discontented in the pace of change. The Constitution that had been in effect until that point was written in 1776 in Virginia, not the Declaration of Independence, but the state constitution. In 1830, a new constitution would be written, which doesn't really add much to satisfy the Westerners, except there would be a branch bank of Virginia that is established in Charleston as one of the reforms that take place in the 1830s. That branch, which stood at the, at the corner of today Capitol Street and Kanawha Boulevard, right there, Cox's Lane and Kanawha Street. This gives you a perspective of Charleston roughly in 1840 when this print was done, and that same corner today. The Union Building right there. This is Wilson's Horseboat Ferry. And if you have no idea what a horseboat ferry is, like I did not some time ago, I looked it up. And a horseboat ferry was a form of motorized ferry using horsepower. Horses actually conveyed the propulsion system across the river. And there were numerous ferries across the canal at that point in time. Notice there were buildings on both sides of Kanawha Street. before the boulevard was built in the mid-20th century, there were buildings lining both sides. These on the riverside became derelict in later years. It's amazing how often in this country we turn our back on our rivers. We used to. Not so much now, because people understand the value of their riverfront. A cataclysmic event would befall Virginia and the nation and sweep up the Kanawha Valley as well. 1861, the Civil War begins. Virginia secedes, at least part of Virginia secedes. The western counties decide they do not want to secede, so they secede from the state that seceded and stay in the Union. I'm going over this with my my West Virginia history class now, and boy, it's a complicated topic. We'll save that for another day. It's fascinating, but extremely complicated when you get into the statehood issue. I'll reduce it to its basics today. April 17th, 1861 in Richmond, the delegates meeting in Richmond decide finally, after several months of being not inclined to secede, after the fall of Fort Sumter, after President Lincoln calls for 75,000 Union volunteers, the delegates in Richmond fall towards secession. And the vote was 88 to 55, with, I believe, 30 or 32, Brian, votes from the western counties voting against secession, including the 2 delegates from Kanawha County. Spicer Patrick and George Summers were the 2 delegates that Kanawha County sent to Richmond. Both of them were slave owners. Both of them voted against secession. So that flies in the face of what everyone thinks a person would vote for if you're a slave owner. It also points to the complicated issue of slavery here in the western part of Virginia. Patrick, these guys were neighbors on the west side. They had farms that were basically 2 farms apart. Spicer Patrick owned a farm above present-day Patrick Street. George Summers owned a farm that is above or right next door to Stonewall Jackson Middle School and above Washington Street. In May of 1861 is the Virginia referendum, taking the secession convention's vote, the delegates who vote for secession, in order for it to be signed, sealed, and delivered and officially take effect. The eligible voters of Virginia, all white males over 21, have to vote for it, which they do overwhelmingly in May of 1861. If you can see that, that is a piece of propaganda that indicates how the vote went in Virginia. If you dared vote no, you were met with the bayonet, an unfriendly end of a rifle. So Westerners were forced to vote yes in some cases. That would indicate. This is actually the rundown, the breakdown of the secession vote in Kanawha County, which is very interesting. I won't go through all of these, but the first precinct that is at the top is the courthouse vote, so that's Charleston. The vote was 132 to ratify the secession ordinance, or to secede, against 430 votes to stay in the Union, to not ratify secession. And you can go on down. Malden, the vote which had the highest concentration of slaves in the county, the vote was 238 to reject secession and only 36 to support it. The total vote at the bottom, 1,695 votes against secession, only 531 in favor. So 3-to-1 majority said we do not want to secede from the Union. Further complicating the topic. Now, when the war begins, I should really turn this over to Terry Lowry, who's in the back of the room. Terry, you have a book that's due out very soon, right?
Right.
Good. We should prod each other to finish our books. In 1861, the Valley and Charleston and Virginia was divided. Loyalties in this area fell in both camps. Both the Confederate support and the Union support was present here. The Confederate supporters immediately begin recruiting troops to defend native soil, followed by loyal U.S. regiments who also muster in. But also Ohio troops, Ohio volunteers, are poised on the other side of the Ohio River to invade Virginia to protect, A, the B&O Railroad, and to squash secession. So when the war begins in earnest in the spring of 1861, one of the most illustrious units to muster in were the Kanawha Riflemen from this area, which had been established by Captain George S. Patton. George Patton from Charleston was the grandfather of General George S. Patton of World War II fame. Captain, later Colonel, later General Patton would perish in 1864 at Third Battle of Winchester.
Right.
The Kanawha Riflemen eventually become part of the 22nd Virginia Infantry Regiment and serve with distinction throughout the war. In May of 1861, Ohio troops begin landing at Parkersburg to protect the B&O Railroad. It's not long after that that the Kanawha Valley would see some of the first fighting of the Civil War. Not the first campaign, but a close second to the first campaign in the Tigard Valley, which begins in May, culminates with the Battle of Rich Mountain in July, and when that battle concludes, Union troops would control the Tigard Valley, protecting the state makers in Wheeling. While that is unfolding, right after the Battle of Rich Mountain on July 11, the first fighting begins here in the Kanawha Valley at Scary Creek. The Kanawha Valley campaign, which unfolds between July and September and continues into the end of the campaigning season of 1861, starts at Scary Creek in July, as I mentioned, moves as Ohio troops enter the Kanawha Valley. General Henry Wise, who was a political general, a former Virginia governor, would control or would command troops here in the valley. Some local troops fell under his command, but he also brought who he called his Wise's Legion across the mountains from eastern Virginia to repel the insolent invaders from Virginia soil. Scary Creek happens on July 17th. At the end of the day, Confederate forces would win the Battle of Scary Creek. There were a series of miscues and mistakes. Captain Patton was seriously wounded but would survive and fight again. Eventually, Confederate forces led by Albert Gallatin Jenkins from the Huntington area, from Green Bottom Plantation, would lead Confederate troops to claim victory that day. It was somewhere between a victory and a stalemate, I guess, but Confederate forces were the last on the field and they essentially won. But realizing that pretty quickly Union troops could encircle and surround Wise and his force, General Wise begins moving back out of the Kanawha Valley upstream, passing through Charleston en route. Charleston also had entrenchments and fortifications during the 1861 campaign. And there are some relics, some artifacts that survive in Charleston that date from before the battle that were, as I say, eyewitnesses to the events of 1861. Now the Kanawha Valley campaign of 61 culminates at Carnifax Ferry in Nicholas County, when Union forces under General Rosie Rosecrans would defeat General John Floyd's Confederate force. Floyd evacuates and pulls farther to the east. As I tell my students, the long story, shortened version is that at the end of 1861, the Kanawha Valley is in the hands of the Union, and owing to the Tigard Valley campaign, the Kanawha Valley campaign, and a Monongahela Valley campaign, which does not have as much fighting, the end result is that the state-making process can continue unabated in Wheeling without threat of being disrupted. Now here in Charleston,
some of the sites that existed or may still exist in some cases, and some of the areas that were strategic to the two sides that are fighting would be the turnpikes coming in and going through Charleston, including the Kanawha Turnpike. There were numerous others, the Fayette, Kanawha, and Giles, I believe, and also the Point Pleasant Turnpike and the Ravenswood Parkersburg Turnpike. Today, they were one turnpike as they came through Charleston to the west side on what today is West Washington Street. At Kanawha 2 Mile, near the Little Page House, the two turnpikes split. The northern branch went to Ravenswood, and the Point Pleasant Turnpike is present-day Route 25, essentially, that would go on to Point Pleasant. The red star is the Little Page Mansion, or the Little Page House. The yellow star is a turnpike bridge, which I think dates from the 1850s. And I'd be interested in asking Terry if he has found any evidence of the history of that bridge in any of his research. This is a map from 1850 that shows the Rock House, the Little Page House, and obviously a bridge over Kanawha 2 Mile Creek. And today, there's the Little Page House, built in 1845, owned by the Charleston Kanawha Housing Authority, and they know what they have. They take very good care of it. They recently moved their offices from that building to another building nearby. That beautiful cut stone arch bridge stands over Kanawha 2 Mile still today, but there is a modern bridge right up against it on the downstream end. And unless you know this bridge is here, you would miss it and not even know it is there. That area now is all covered in brush most of the time, and I think that dates from the earliest construction of the turnpike. There'd be no reason to build it after the mid-1800s because the technology would have improved to the point where iron and later steel bridges would have been built. That's a view of the bridge about 1900. For perspective, you're actually coming down Sissonville Road on the left. That's Kanawha 2 Mile. General Wise's forces camped in the bottoms all around the Little Page House. They also fortified the high ground above today, present-day Orchard Manor, and above where you see the little hill sticking out, the knoll, where the road wraps around today, where Washington Street goes into Charleston on top of that hill as well, which is now all densely populated. Other artifacts from that 1861 campaign that are still out there include the Craig Patton House, the Craig Patton House, which was built in 1834 by James Craig, used to stand just on the other side of Dunbar Street from Charleston Catholic High School. It was moved to the 1300 block of Lee Street, where it stood until about 1970, and then it was moved. Is that right, Bree? I saw Bree in the ground somewhere. Around 1970, it was moved to its present location in Daniel Boone Park. And George S. Patton lived there with his wife, although he spent a sizable amount of time fighting during the Civil War. Didn't stay there very often, but his wife lived there, and then she left after his death. Also, in Ruffner Park today is the Kanawha Rifleman Monument, which was erected in the early 1900s, commemorating the service of the Kanawha Riflemen, which later became a company, Company H, I believe, of the 22nd Virginia. And if you read the muster roll, which is the roster of the roll on the plaque, it's a veritable who's who among Charleston families, first families. Now we have to fast forward another year to the 1862 campaign here, and this is one that doesn't get much airplay. That's going to be corrected with Terry's book that's going to come out later this year, but Charleston witnessed, and its residents were caught up in, a battle on September, where is it? on the next slide, September 13th, 1862, where Union forces under General Joseph Lightburn fought a retreating action, is probably the best way to describe it, against superior Confederate forces. As they retreated through Charleston, the fighting began early in the day on the east side of town, continued through Charleston, through the afternoon, crossed a suspension bridge over Elk River. Retreating Union forces cut the cables on the bridge to slow the Confederates who were following them. And the latest statistics that I have, and Terry probably has an updated number, of the Kanawha Valley campaign, which was almost a week-long campaign starting in and around Fayetteville and continuing all the way essentially to Point Pleasant. You can see the casualty figures. Not a high number of casualties unless you happen to be one of those casualties. Or you happen to be a resident in Charleston when the Battle of Charleston was being fought over your head on September 13th. I'll refer back to this slide. A number of buildings in Charleston were put to the torch by the retreating Union Army as they evacuated Charleston, heading toward the Ohio, including the Bank of Virginia, the Kanawha House, which is the large double chimney building you see just beyond, the Mercer Academy, which was up river about another block and a half. So Charleston did have serious damage after the battle, which lingered apparently until after the war in some cases. When the Confederates occupied Charleston, they were here for about 6 weeks. The only true Confederate occupation of the Civil War for any length of time. And during that period, General Loring set up a military government, published a newspaper, and went to Malden and nearby salt furnace areas and liberated the salt stores because they were needed to fight the Confederate cause. This is a quote that I'm especially fond of. Charleston resident, a prominent name, brother of one of the bankers of the Bank of Virginia, J.C. McFarland, says, by the coming in of the Confederates, 2 things were accomplished. These, or that is to say, the getting of several thousand barrels of salt and the marriage of 2 young girls. By late October, Confederate forces retreat. Charleston and the Kanawha Valley would be occupied by Union troops for essentially the duration of the war. Now, one of the Union companies that, or regiments that are here, are stationed here, would be the 23rd Ohio Volunteers. And among the troops that were in the 23rd was Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, who commanded the 23rd Ohio, and Private, later Lieutenant, and then Major William McKinley. Those troops were here to basically protect the valley from further southern incursions, to keep from using the valley corridor to channel supplies to the Western Theater. And in May of 1863, the 23rd Ohio would build a fort on the heights overlooking Charleston, which still exists to this day. Fort Scammon stands at the top of, guess where? Fort Hill. Yes. I tell my students that. Can you guess where a fort might be built in Charleston? Let's see. There's a Fort Hill. That's it. And if you're not familiar with Fort Hill, if you've ever been out Corridor G to Dudley Farms and that big complex down here, as soon as you turn off the river and head up Oakwood Road, you're at the base of Fort Hill if you look to your right or to the west. The top of that hill is Fort Scammon, which exists now in the middle of a residential neighborhood. It has been excavated over the years. The city of Charleston owns it. It is on the National Register. However, there's no interpretation at the fort itself, unfortunately. I hope that that may change in the future. But right now there's a highway marker, and that's really about it. It's difficult to get there without signage because the roads all intertwine and you wind up making circles sometimes. Personal stories before we leave the Civil War, because we got a lot of history still to cover. Rutherford Hayes often was visited by his wife and family while he was here in Charleston. His wife brought their 4 boys and often her mother, which I'm sure the Colonel probably enjoyed that. His mother-in-law showing up. They would come to spend periods of time with the Colonel and visit. They typically stayed in the Quarry or Cottage on the south side of Charleston. One particular trip when Lucy brought the boys and her mother, their youngest son died. Joseph died of dysentery after being here only a few days. And Rutherford Hayes in his journals has a number of entries talking about young Joseph's death and the tragedy and how despondent his wife was when he died. He also says that he was not especially attached to the boy because he did not know him that well, because he'd been off fighting for most of his young life at that point. Now, another son, their oldest son, Webb, spent summers here with his father while his father was in camp here at Camp White on the south side. Spent long periods of time. He became friends with General George Crook, who also was here, who was a famed Indian fighter. And Webb went on hunting trips here in the Kanawha Valley, later went out west with General Crook, and also he later would be a Medal of Honor winner himself, and went on to be one of the founders of a company that later became a founding company in Union Carbide Corporation. So himself, he would become quite well known and famous, had very fond memories of his boyhood escapades here in Charleston. This is just a letter that Rutherford wrote describing the death of their son, especially poignant. He died without suffering, lay on the table in our room in the Quarry Cottage, surrounded by white roses and buds all the morning, and was sent to Cincinnati for burial. His wife came back a number of times to visit Rutherford until he moved out with the 23rd Ohio. Now, Charleston has a number of houses that date from the antebellum period. They are now affectionately known as the Seven Sisters. And stay tuned, because very soon you'll probably be hearing about a number of open houses that are going to take place in a number of these houses on June 20th during the day as part of the sesquicentennial celebration. The houses include the 2 I've already mentioned, Little Page and Craig Patton. Daniel Ruffner's home, 1815 to 1817 it was built. Although I always point out that it's known as Holly Grove today, and it stands next to the governor's mansion. The Holly Grove you see today was not the Holly Grove that was built. That portico on the front was added about 1905. And also, there was an attic put on the top of the house. So when the Ruffners owned it, it was a plain, rather plain looking federal style, which was very stylish for the day, home. The Henry Wood home, which is in Canal City on Roosevelt Avenue, was built in 1830. It doesn't get much publicity. It's privately owned, and it faces the river, which was the front door and the main avenue at the time it was built. The McFarland Hubbard House, which today is the office of the West Virginia Humanities Council. Glenwood Estate, which has the main house and also the slave quarters opposite Stonewall Jackson. And another little remembered Ruffner home, because it's been swallowed up by larger houses near it. You don't notice it so much. The August Ruffner home, which stands at 1506 Canal Boulevard. That house will be open. Glenwood will be open. Craig Patton will be open. Maybe Holly Grove for the June 20th celebration. And Henry Wood, perhaps. No, Bree says no, it won't be. Oh, McFarland Hubbard. Can't forget that. A number of other Civil War related things around Charleston include the mysterious monument to the 2 female spies that were executed in the holler above where Camp White used to be, where the Sunrise Carriage Trail meanders to the top of the Sunrise Estate. Booker T. Washington's monument, which used to stand off of Route 60 near Malden, was moved to the Capitol some years ago. Ironically, a Stonewall Jackson statue in a northern Union state, supposedly. And interestingly, it was pointed out recently to me that Abe Lincoln is standing pensively between Stonewall Jackson and the monument that commemorates the service of 32,000 Union soldiers from West Virginia on opposite sides of the Capitol complex. And then around the backside of the Capitol is another monument to the home guard that protected the home front during the Civil War. The Civil War experts in here know this story, but some of you may not. And my students like this because they all know the movie Glory. Major John Appleton moved to Charleston after the Civil War. He actually was from Massachusetts. He was an abolitionist. He moved here to work in the coal industry, lived in Charleston, also had a farm in Monroe County, became adjutant general here, lived here for almost 50 years, and he was one of the first recruits in the 54th Massachusetts, and also one of the recruiters that recruited the troops that served in the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment. A personal friend of Robert Gould Shaw, who commanded the 54th, and he is buried at Spring Hill Cemetery. Oh, floating Capitol, quickly. Brian, I would beg to differ about Wheeling and Charleston. The Capitol has moved, as most of you know, many, many, many times. We've had temporary capitals. We now have a permanent capital. Charleston has had 4 separate capitals, at least at 4 different times. And we began with Wheeling, which would lose the capital due to political shifts by 1870. Charleston becomes the second capital. The first Capitol building in Charleston was a beautiful structure that you see pictured here, erected in 1870 when the decision to move the Capitol here was made by the legislature for the reason stated that it will develop the natural resources of the state the most and accommodate the largest number of inhabitants. Unfortunately, at the time, Charleston was hard to get to. The best way to get here was on the river. If you were from the northern part of the state, from Wheeling, you went down the Ohio and up the canal. The railroad would not arrive until 1873. So immediately when Charleston becomes the state capital, some of the members of the West Virginia legislature and others begin complaining about the provincial nature of the new capital. John P. Hale, again, one of the luminaries that has a lot to do with the early history of Charleston, put up his private money to build this building. He and a number of private investors actually paid to erect this very lovely structure, which would only serve as a capital for 5 years before the capital moved back to Wheeling in 1875. The legislature, in a surprise move, decides Wheeling is the place for the capital again. However, we are a litigious society, right? When in doubt, and I apologize to the attorneys in the audience, but Charleston residents sued to keep the state records in Charleston. The legislature had moved to Wheeling in May of 1875, but the records stayed here. So imagine trying to conduct business with all the official records of the state remaining in Charleston under an injunction. Ultimately, in September of 1875, a state Supreme Court of Appeals case was decided in favor of Wheeling. The records followed the legislature and government officials to Wheeling. The business of the state was conducted in Wheeling for 2 years until 1877, when it was decided to put the location of a permanent capital. There had never been mention of a permanent capital up to that point. And if you look at the old Constitution, it did not say that there is a permanent capital. Charleston would eventually become the permanent capital after a vote in 1877. But at the time, when Charleston becomes the capital the first time, in 1875, John Hale forever the entrepreneur, built the finest hotel in Charleston called the Hale House, which stood where the Ruffner Hotel stood later on. The Hale House eventually burned in 1885, but the Hale House, built by Hale. Hale, by the way, lived right across the street right here at the bottom of Hale Street and Canal Boulevard. The Hale House stood where the Ruffner House is. The Capitol was back here. That's the later 1885 Capitol in the background. The Hale House had 100 rooms, and if I read the literature properly, it had 1 bathroom. And that was considered to be modern at the time. Imagine that. It did not keep the Capitol here, however. As I said, it went back to Wheeling in 1877. The Ruffner Hotel would replace the Hale House. And Stan, some of you have memories of the Ruffner Hotel, as I do. When Charleston is chosen as the permanent capital, there's a vote in 1877. Charleston wins with over 41,000 votes, followed by Clarksburg and Martinsburg. By the way, Ohio County voters voted for Clarksburg. They didn't vote for Charleston. May of 1885, the records, the legislature come back to Charleston. By then, the Capitol that had been built in 1870 was no longer large enough to accommodate the government, so there was a new and better Capitol built that was still under construction, completed in 1887, and it was a magnificent Victorian structure, and there it is in all its glory. That occupied the entire city block between Capitol Street, Dickinson Street, State Street, or Lee Street today, and Washington Street. It stood and accommodated the government until 1921, when it also burned to the ground. This is a panoramic view. By the way, if you're not familiar with that website that I have up there, my West Virginia home is a site that was put up by Jerry Waters, a Charleston resident, who, if you go there often, he's always got new photos of scenes of Charleston and the surrounding area, and it's utterly fascinating. This is a panoramic view of the 1885 Capitol with the governor's mansion, the executive mansion right there. That's the old YMCA for perspective. This is today Davis Park. That's the Capitol, and back here is the old Capitol Annex, which was built in 1903 to make more office space available because the Capitol had already grown too small for the expanding government. The formative years of Charleston, between the 1880s and 1940, the population in some decades was doubled in Charleston. We start to become a true city by 1900, 1910, about World War I era. And if you follow the population growth up to World War II, we go from 22,000 to almost 40,000 in a decade. Population now is just over 51,000. Charleston's still the largest city in West Virginia because Huntington has lost more population than Charleston, and Huntington's population is hovering just under 50,000 right now. The East End becomes the first residential neighborhood because downtown Charleston is growing. When the Capitol moves there permanently in 1885, streetcars are all the rage, and the streetcar line gets built to the East End. A loop would run from downtown Charleston through the East End, back into town, eventually gets expanded at both ends, up the Kanawha Valley and down the valley. This is the 1100 block of Virginia Street, which today, the only thing recognizable in there, if you know what to look for, is the Frankenberger residence right there. You see the little tower. That's the old WCHS TV radio station today. It has a brick facade. If you look beyond the brick front, you'll see the old mansion behind it. The East End was the address to have in Charleston. The finest homes, that could be built by the finest craftsmen you will find, built these homes with beautiful hardwood, clay tile roofs, slate roofs, the latest styles. In fact, virtually every style in American architecture from the late 1800s to World War II you'll find in the east end of Charleston, still today. Today, we are a historic district, fortunately, and it's led to the preservation of a lot of the beautiful homes. But this is a postcard of the corner of Ruffner and Virginia Street, circa 1910. That's the same view about 2 years ago. Has not changed. By the way, those of you who know the history of the Kanawha River will recognize Addison Scott's name. This is his house. He lived right here. He was an engineer, civil engineer who engineered the improvements on the Kanawha River in the late 1800s. The streetcar came right down Virginia Street. One of the things that leads to Charleston's rapid growth would be the first railroads. The C&O comes in across the river on the south side in 1873. A lot of skeptics said that Charleston would never prosper because the railroad's on the wrong side of the river. And indeed, at the time, there was no bridge across the Kanawha River. So you had to ferry across, and it would take a while, but in 20 years, we get the South Side Bridge, and then eventually the C&O is incorporated into Charleston. The West Side's development, in a large part, is due to the building of the Kanawha, Michigan, completed in 1883 through Charleston to Point Pleasant, or actually the other way around from Point Pleasant to Charleston. It extended on upriver in the 1890s. There is a fantastic Whipple Truss, very historic bridge, one of the most historic bridges in the state, that still spans the Elk River, which was built in 1883 to carry the K&M into Charleston and out of Charleston to Point Pleasant. And that's it right there. The city of Charleston owns it, and ideally it will be preserved. Fingers crossed. The K&M depot, which was demolished to make way for the interstate in the 1970s, the passenger depot stood right next to today's Capitol Market. A beautiful structure. Unfortunately, there's an interstate pillar right there now. The C&O Bridge across the canal, built in, I think, 1906, still standing, but now in jeopardy. It was abandoned by CSX some years ago. Efforts to turn it into a rail trail have stalled because of the cost, and it's now just standing awaiting its fate, as we say. To backtrack a minute to the bullet surveys, if you've forgotten about them, eventually the West Side Bullet Survey, that parcel over 1,200 acres, would convey to the children of George Clendenin. Ultimately, Joseph Lovell and his stepfather, James Bream, would acquire the bullet lands on the west side, eventually divide them and give them to their children when James married Mary Bream, and the Bream children would further divide the holdings, but for about half of the 1800s, the Bream lands were still farmland, and they remained farmland until, in some cases, the 1890s, when the west side starts to develop, when the railroad arrives, and when it becomes more profitable to divide the land rather than farm it. I grew up on the west side, going up Elk off of Bigley Avenue, and there's an Alethea Street in my neighborhood. And I never knew what the Alethea stood for, except one of James Bream's daughters was Alethea Bream. And I believe that's probably the upstream boundary of the Bream lands. The development of the west side begins with J.B. Walker, John Brisbane Walker, who was a visionary man who, throughout most of his life, had a scheme or a vision that was never realized. The west side would be developed after he was gone in the 1890s, but Walker begins to divide holdings on the west side. He starts to purchase property, but the panic of 1873 would force him to lose his first fortune, which he eventually makes back and loses it again. Walker stays here a few short years, is a man with a vision to divide the West Side, and in fact lays out lots. And the street names on the west side of Charleston we owe to J.B. Walker. The names of Maryland Avenue, the counties and the state names of the streets on the west side, they were all laid out by J.B. Walker. Walker would end up leaving the Kanawha Valley in the 1870s. He bought Cosmopolitan magazine when it was a struggling magazine, and he ended up selling it to William Randolph Hearst at a huge profit. He also moved to Denver, Colorado, and had a vision to turn a beautiful outdoor natural area known as Red Rocks into an amphitheater, which was never done in his lifetime. Everybody thought he was crazy. If you ever go to Red Rocks, it's a beautiful amphitheater today. Now, streetcars would link the city. They would eventually yield to buses. I'm running out of time, so I will kind of move through fairly quickly. Edgewood development was Charleston's first suburb on the west side. Today it's part of Charleston, but Edgewood was developed as a select suburb to escape the dirt and grime and hustle and bustle of the city. It was on the streetcar line. You could take the streetcar all the way to the top of Edgewood, where there was an amusement park. From 1906 to about 1912, it existed all the way at the end of the streetcar line, and not above the streetcar line, but below it. A lot of people look for Edgewood Park where the Edgewood Country Club is today. That's the wrong place. You have to look below on the hillside, which is about this steep. And it was just carved out of the hillside on a couple of tiers. It would be replaced by a greater park, Luna Park, which unfortunately would be consumed by fire in 1923. Luna Park stood on the west side on the flats, and the neighborhood today is now listed on the National Register, just got listed a few years ago. But you can recognize where Luna Park was if you look on a map, because the original park roads still exist today, and that's the old park boundary. Park Avenue is Park Avenue because of Luna Park. Park Drive, which went around Luna Park, today is Lovell Drive, and it comes back to the boulevard. But if you look at a map, you'll notice all the streets are laid out on a grid except one little neighborhood, and that's where Luna Park was. One of the mysteries of Ruffner Park, which I've always been intrigued at, and I was told years ago by Richard Andre that there are some graves still in Ruffner Park, even though it's technically a park. And it never made sense to me until I actually found an article, and then Jerry Waters has it on his website. In 1920, the city of Charleston was looking for a city park. We didn't have one. And parkland has always been an issue in Charleston. We've not seemingly in our history had enough parks for the population here. In 1920, the city actually took the old Ruffner Cemetery, apparently laid most of the headstones over, covered them up, and turned it into a park, which it is today. Ruffner Cemetery is still designated as a cemetery officially. And there have been numerous cases where there have been attempts to develop playgrounds in the park, and those attempts have been headed off because it's still a cemetery. And people say that visitors should just commemorate and quietly contemplate the park, and that's why there's nothing essentially in the park except a couple of memorials. But this is actually a map of who's buried in the park that appeared in the Charleston Gazette in the 1950s, and it dates from 1917. And it's very interesting, over 100 graves. I would love to get some ground penetrating radar and see if anything's left. Now the real growth in Charleston, and I'll wrap up with this, would be these two anchor developments. Before we had anchor stores at a mall, we had anchor factories in Charleston, on either end of that went into operation about 1917 and operated roughly until 1980. The Libby Owens glass plant and the later Owens, Illinois bottling plant. And Michael Owens, for whom the Owens is named, was a West Virginian who developed a technique for making bottles that revolutionized the industry. Those plants combined straddled McCorkle Avenue, where today the shops at Canal are, where Lowe's and all those developments are, and they employed 700 plus workers in their heyday. Now at the other end of town, on the west side, the lower end of Charleston, at the base of Patrick Street Bridge, was the world's largest axe factory. Opened in 1905, it was moved from the Midwest because of the abundant natural gas here. Another reason the glass plant was here, cheap fuel to make glass and also to make tools. And the Kelly plant later became a true temper plant. It was in operation until 1982 and employed about 1,000 workers. And the development of the flat area of the west side of Charleston around this owes its existence to that plant. I'll wrap up on a somber note. The burning of the Capitol, 1921. At that point, we get the modern Capitol. Another thing I'd always heard as a boy but could never put it together was the story that there's only one remnant of the old Capitol left in Charleston. Well, actually, there are more now because there are bits and pieces of the Capitol all over town. But one remnant actually on the ground of the old Capitol, and that's the corner of the Capitol lawn. And I never figured out what that meant until I looked at an old Sanborn map. And on this map, you'll see this is the old state capitol. When it burned, State Street, today Lee Street, before the Capitol burned, the Capitol property extended all the way out to here. And if you were traveling on State Street, you had to do a dogleg around the Capitol that way, and it becomes Lee Street. After the Capitol burned and was removed, this was cut through. That little island, which today is Triangle Park, was the old corner of the Capitol lawn. And that's why Lee Street has those two weird components that eventually come together on the other side of the Dickinson. That's the old corner of the Capitol right there. So now I can visualize it. And then we get a pasteboard Capitol that also burns, but by then the present state Capitol was under construction and government offices were moving to the present location right here. Any questions? I'll wrap up since we're probably over time. We need to get these chairs up, right, Brian? Thank you.
That Triangle Park, that historic marker there is the very first historic marker place.
You should put a historic marker up to commemorate the historic
Marker. We have one of those. Any questions for Dr. Peyton?
What happened to the other Capitol building that was first built?
Some sources say it was demolished, but I think part of it was inside the larger Capitol. It doesn't make sense to demolish a perfectly good building used for 5 years. And if you look at the footprint of the new one, it's just an expanded version of the old, really. So I have a feeling it was in there.
Why do you think all these, I know if they were built from wood, you know, they would be flammable, but they look like brick or...
Oh yeah, the 1885 Capitol was, in fact, as fireproof as you could get a building at the time. The fire, when it began, was of unknown origin, and there are several theories as to what happened, but the fire was hastened by 50,000 rounds of ammunition that was stored in the Capitol by the National Guard. Because 1921, the mine wars were going on, and it was also right after World War I, and the Capitol was used as an armory as well. So when the flames hit that ammunition, the whole thing went up. And even though the building itself was fireproof, there was a lot of flammable material in it. Curtains, documents, furniture, the walls.
That Capitol Annex, that you
Yes, sir.
say across from the Capitol.
That's right. Yeah, where National Bank and Commerce or Huntington Banks is now.
Yeah, it became a library, but then it had a fire, didn't it?
It actually did catch fire, but it was already being demolished when it caught fire, and it was on its way down at the time to build the bank tower. But it did catch fire, you're right. Morris Harvey College was also in there for a short period of time.
It was a library for a while.
Yeah, it sure was, yeah.
I
Our
remember
first
it
trip
had
to the
pretty
library
good-
was in
It
there.
had real beautiful wood inside.
Yes,
I
it
think-
did. It was a unique building. And there is a capital annex capital, one of the columns, has been put in the Triangle Park, the base of it. And also on the campus of UC, there are parts of columns over there.
I'm
Yes, ma'am.
curious, the Old Stone Bridge and Fort Scammon, are there any efforts underway to preserve those?
No, just by benign neglect, right? I mean, let me back up. Fort Scammon is maintained by the city, yes. The city does mow it and maintains it. The neighborhood is very protective of Fort Scammon,
Okay.
and they look out for it. If anything bad goes on there, they keep a pretty close eye on it. Because the houses are literally, within spitting distance of the fort itself. They're all around it.
So you said there's nothing but that marker to
That's
commemorate it?
correct, yeah. And I'd like to see that changed. I'd really like to see something up there to actually tell people what it is.
Yeah.
Even though there was never a battle there, it is a Civil War fort.
Now, was there, I can't recall, at the Old Stone Bridge, wasn't there a battle there, or didn't something happen near there during?
During the 1861 campaign, Wise's troops were camped all in that bottom. But Terry, I don't think there was actually any fighting right there, was there?
In '62, there was a little skirmish during
In
that
the
'62 campaign.
Battle of Charleston. There was.
That was where it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in '62 on Glenwood property, which Glenwood Estate ran all the way from basically the top of probably about where Stonewall Drive is today, all the way down to Canal River, about 366 acres of farmland. And the Little Page Estate was over 1,000 acres. That's good news. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Couple questions. When the capital was getting moved back and forth in the 70s and 80s, what was the population of Wheeling compared to Charleston? Number one. Number two, why wasn't Wheeling on the list for the of the three cities that were considered?
Wheeling was the only real city in West Virginia. Wheeling's population in 1870 was about 19,000, I think. And Wheeling was truly an industrial city. It had the Beto Railroad, it had navigation on the Ohio, it had the National Road. It was the gateway to the West. Wheeling was not even considered, it was not.
No. Well, what happens in the 1870s, we have redemption take place in West Virginia. We have a lot of the old Southern Confederates coming back into power in the state government. And when that happens, a lot of the old guard Republicans are actually die off. Wakeman Willie dies.
And others were not,
Pierpoint and others die.
re-elected to office.
Right.
If you
Right.
look at the state government by 1875, I don't think any of the state makers are in it anymore. Even earlier than that, probably by 1872.
And it's no mistake that Wheeling's not part of the vote.
Yeah.
It was
intentional.
It was intentional, right? Intentional to keep it off of the.
Because most of the early founders were from Parkersburg or Wheeling.
Right.
Clarksburg, Morgantown, yes, Parkersburg,
And,
and Wheeling.
and there's a generational change if you're talking by that time.
Yeah, in a relatively short period of time. It's a fascinating transition. And by then also Wheeling was not centrally located in terms of getting people there. With railroads being built throughout the state now, including the C&O here, you could get to Charleston.
It was stolen.
Still couldn't get to the Eastern Panhandle. Still, today, it's a long drive to the Eastern Panhandle. Yes, sir.
I've heard that Moundsville had the choice between West Virginia University and the Capitol, and they chose, the
Penitentiary?
prison and the penitentiary. Is that a true story?
It was
It was actually,
the prison and the university.
yeah.
Prison
yeah.
and university, is that a true story?
That,
Yes.
I've always
I've always-
heard
that's what
read
I've
that,
heard.
yeah, I think it is.
And it wouldn't have been West Virginia University, it would actually been, they were talking about West Liberty being a college as well.
It was the university or the prison?
All right, because the West Virginia University started in 1867, and the prison, I think, is 1866
It was, yeah, within a year, I think.
of doing that.
And that would have been because there's more jobs at the prison?
Yeah, I think that was one of the arguments is,
Right.
not, at that time, the university was, the enrollment was in the hundreds, maybe, and it was not that large. More opportunity.
And if you look at the prison, the size of the prison itself, the construction of the prison itself would have eclipsed what the university.
Which was only 2 buildings when it started, basically, 3.
Yeah, they had 5 graduates the first couple of years, so.
Thank you all for
Well,
coming. Oh, one more.
I just gonna point out something real quick, just to keep the Civil War nuts like me from ever, you know how they can be. Colonel George S. Patton never technically became a general.
He was not a brigadier?
That's a popular misconception, and it's written a lot of places,
Yeah.
secondary sources. Reportedly, what happened to him was he was under consideration to be promoted, and supposedly it was approved, but he died before it was brought to him. And there is no valid documentation to back it up, it's just hearsay.
Okay.
And remember, when Richmond burned, millions of documents burned, and there is no valid documentation to verify that. He may have been, but there is no valid documentation of it.
Okay, so we'll keep him as a colonel,
Right.
rightfully so.
Thanks for coming
Thanks
out.
for taking.
The baby,